Hi, welcome back to Your Brain On, the lyrical analysis show for all of you guys out there who just can't get enough of words and what they mean. On today's episode, we will be discussing the music of Nick Drake, the Myanmar-born English-raised folk musician and one of my favorite artists of all time. His legacy resides in this upper echelon of musicians shrouded in mystique due to their reclusive behavior and poor commercial reception when alive, and then unfortunate early passings. And as a result, his work has this air of exclusivity around it to many of his fans, which part of me can't really blame people for. He's one of those artists where much of what we have to go off by when assessing personality is the music, and then some anecdotes we just sort of have to take at face value. Sure, the information is there if you go looking, but he's just one of those musicians where the legend outweighs the fact. He was introverted and reportedly riddled with anxiety, with one of his most famous traits being that he was very reluctant to perform live or even really market his work sometimes. Here are some quotes that we do have from people in his life that knew him one way or another. His father remembered in one of his reports, the headmaster said that none of us seemed to know him very well. All the way through with Nick, people didn't know him very much. In an interview, his sister Gabrielle said, "He was very secretive. I knew he was making an album, but I didn't know what stage of completion it was at until he walked into my room and said, 'There you are.' He threw it on my bed and walked out." Ralph McTell, who also performed that night, remembered, "Nick was monosyllabic. At that particular gig, he was very shy. He did the first set and something awful must have happened. He was doing his song Fruit Tree and walked off halfway through it." So we can recognize that, myths and legends aside, Nick Drake was certainly a man of few words and famously antisocial. So what I'm really looking to do today is how we can take the lyrics of his songs, the environment in which he was talking the most, sharing the most about how he felt, and derive the meaning and his philosophy from that. And there's plenty more to go on in terms of just the history and information about him, but that's not really why we're here. That's probably information for a different video. So we'll just kind of leave it at that. And despite poor commercial performance and bad critical reception when Nick Drake was alive, his music has hit a pretty massive wave of popularity over the years, and with his posthumous recognition outweighing the previous popularity by an incredibly wide margin. So we are going to get into the lyrics of 3 of his songs, 1 from each of his 3 studio albums, and then we'll see what we find.
When the day is done, down to earth and sinks the sun, along with everything that was lost and won.
Day is Done is the 5th track off of Drake's first album, 5 Leaves Left. The opening chorus presents this idea of finality and conclusions, saying that when the day is done, the sun sinks along with everything lost and won, saying that when it's time to end, good or bad, everything is going to go with it. You could argue that this is in reference to death as the ultimate finality, saying that when we die, we take everything we are and everything we could be with us, leaving behind nothing but the legacy others may care to preserve. The when the day is done concept and imagery is repeated each verse with a replacement of a similar phrase in each one. When the night is cold, when the bird has flown, when the game's been fought, when the party's through, all focused on this final transition. Primarily with this focus on something that maybe was desired to be achieved, but ultimately couldn't be in the end, which is especially shown in the line, "Seems so very sad for you, didn't do the things you meant to do," which I think is honestly a pretty common fear, you know? Knowing that life is finite and you may not ever be able to achieve what you so desperately want to is pretty disheartening, and in his tone, Nick Drake approaches this idea with a pretty somber, bleak acceptance rather than, say, an erratic panic. Even though this was a couple years before his death, I can't help but bridge the connections between his desolate lyrics here and his later behavior, which grew more intense and angry in the final year of his life. Do I think the lyrics in Day is Done are prophetic? No, not necessarily. But I do think that the presentation of them, it's pretty easy to connect the dots to his unfortunate passing in retrospect listening to the song. But I don't think it's just about death here, and I think that immediately assigning that label to it would just kind of be taking the context of his early passing, because you can also look at the lyrics, then you find you jump the gun, have to go back where you began. So that suggests something a little less intense and maybe more cyclical. When we find ourselves at the end of a particular time in our lives, we see that our troubles and goals will sometimes loop, and we find ourselves back where we began, making any progress we made feel kinda useless, feel like it was all for naught. But either way you look at it, it remains somber and an almost acceptance of defeat in a way. One of these things, first from his second album, Brighter Later, also addresses this concept in maybe a much more colorful and imagery-filled way. So that one's also good if you like the way this is written. Speaking of Brighter Later, let's get to our second song.
Please, give me second grace.
The opening chorus of this song is where I really think you can derive the bulk of the meaning and the writing behind the song. Please give me a second grace, please give me a second face. I've fallen far down the first time around. Now I just sit on the ground in your way. There's two things that I think that you could easily look at in this batch of lyrics, two kind of main meanings you could take from it. One being a little more literal than the other, being that reception to Drake's first album was poor and marketing was lackluster, and his involvement in getting the album heard was minimal and half-hearted at best. So you could view these lyrics as a pretty straightforward plea for a second chance to hear what he has to say in his music, to listen to what he's got going on, which I think is fine. I think that's a pretty fair interpretation, but not really the direction that I would go in, I guess. When you factor in lines like, so come ride in my streetcar by the bay, for now I must know how fine you are in your way, and the sea she will sigh, but she won't need to cry, for it's really too hard for the fly. I think this is much more rooted in Drake's destitute emotional state and how it affects those around him, although it appears to be a little more hopeful and level-headed than a song like Day Is Done. And that's because on this song, Drake is asking for a second chance, acknowledging fault, and claiming to be a burden in the way of others, but still hoping to kind of see that change, and still recognizing that it may not be too late. It's not as absolute. So although Drake is still viewing himself as a burden here, showing a deprecating perspective, we still have this idea that a position like the one he is in, from his perspective, is one to be forgiven, something to bounce back from. Because no matter how you look at some of the lyrics on this track, somebody asking for help shows that they aren't ready to give up yet. So with that, I find the writing on this song dejected but not final, open to change and bittersweet resolution. Unrelated, but this song was also featured on the soundtrack for The Royal Tenenbaums, directed by Wes Anderson, which I just love. Great movie. We now approach the final song from his final album, Pink Moon.
When I was young, younger than before, I never saw the truth hanging from the door.
Place to Be is probably my favorite Nick Drake track. It's also one of his most bleak and pensive songs, showcasing a profound melancholy and longing for the past. It is very uncomfortable with the present. Every verse is this past and present comparison of how Nick Drake views himself now and then. When I was young, I was blissfully naive. Now I'm old and I have to look reality in the face. When I was green, I flourished and I was bright as the sun and I bared life. And now I'm dark and without purpose. When I was strong, I could see myself on the other side of my problems. Now I'm weak and see nothing left for me to do. No more weight for me to hold. Dude, it tears me apart. It's such a heart-wrenching perspective for somebody to have hardly into his 20s. At such a young age, he already saw his life as barren, depleted, and finished. And the entirety of Pink Moon perpetuates this idea the most. Apart from a brief piano passage, this album is pretty much just Nick Drake and his guitar. It feels up close and personal, which only furthers the feeling that this album is Nick Drake using his voice to be open and communicative in the only way he knew how to. The lyrics of this song reflect a withered and tattered state, the words of somebody who has lived a long and tumultuous enough lifetime to be able to look back and long for those younger days of innocence, even though he was only 23 when the song released. And I think about it from that context, right? I mean, I am 23 years old, and many other fans of his are also around my age, all belonging to this newer generation that could only appreciate Nick Drake within the context of his legacy, not his lifetime. And I find songs like Place to Be, as bleak as they may be, gorgeous and above all, relatable. Although he was not recognized commercially or critical in his lifetime, Nick Drake's music has found new life in an audience that finds comfort in such an honest and upfront depiction of emotions that so many other people go through. His work, especially Pink Moon, helped others feel seen and not alone, and although he passed so unfortunately early, the struggle is preserved in an appreciation for what a unique talent and person he was. His beautifully poignant writing persists, and there's so much to get out of it. Anyways, that'll do it for this episode of Your Brain On. I would love to hear what you guys think about these songs and maybe the meanings that you derive and get out of the lyrics and the songwriting, whether, it lines up with what I've said, or, maybe you've got an entirely different interpretation. I would sure love to hear it. That's kind of the entire point of this show. Until then, I've been Melmige, and you've been great. Bye.